Okay, quick question. When was the last time you actually had a good healthcare experience? It's a tough one, right? I hear you. The truth is, whether you're in pharma, in healthcare, a patient or caregiver, or just someone trying to stay well, we all bump up against this tangled, complicated system. Let's be honest, it's not working the way it should. But here's the thing, we can do better. And it takes all of us to build something smarter, fairer, and more human. And this is why I'm so excited about Pharmageddon events by Impatient Health, a movement shaking things up in conversations we absolutely must have. And I'm so excited that a discussion about these events are part of the inaugural episodes 1 and 2 of this podcast. So welcome to IPZO Facto, where when it comes to innovation, there's no way but forward. I'm Zina Manji, a regulatory strategist in healthcare innovation, professional maze runner of the life sciences industry. I spent over 20 years working with big pharma, engaging with scrappy startups and medtech trailblazers, chasing down ideas that could actually make a difference. Now with InnoPathways, my mission is simple: decode the chaos of healthcare innovation and help people live better, healthier lives through new innovations. Because we don't need more buzzwords, we need bold moves. So if you're picking up what I'm putting down here, go ahead and subscribe, like this video, and drop a comment below. Not because of the algorithm alone, because this does help, but so that we can build this thing together, bring in amazing guests, and serve up better, braver conversations about healthcare's future and insights and strategies and actions. All right, so let's dive in. The full episode is coming up right after the highlight reel.
Exactly, and we can ask those questions like, what would it take for pharma to become the most trusted industry in the world?
But how are we going to design healthcare for serving the generation of 5 years from now, right?
The future is here, and are we ready to listen?
We are impacted so much more quickly by one action somewhere.
Incrementalism is not the answer to a motivated team. So Audacity attracts attention, which creates accountability, which drives action.
That balance between incremental innovation and then that radical innovation. This is where sort of our work in disruptive innovation sits. Backcasting, and a lot of times people do forecasting. So this is the opposite of that. It's backcasting to say, that's what I want. What am I going to do to get there? So any company that does forecasting is doing it wrong. And I'll tell you why.
Things that not necessarily are at our forefront of what we are thinking about in our day-to-day lives. What are they hesitant about? What are we going to find the blockers in the future? And how do we have a conversation that means that we don't end up in a sticky situation?
But it really relies on us understanding what is that goal that we're headed towards.
And without action, Audacity is just noise.
Who better to experiment than a discipline that focuses on science?
And we're going to really take people out of their comfort zones completely and make them think.
Well, hello. Welcome to the next episode of IPZO Facto podcast. I'm Zina Manji, your host, and I am so thrilled to have back with me today Lucy Osborne and Noreen Sajwani. We are going to be discussing the next part of the Pharmageddon event, and this is really around how the agenda is organized. And I think this is really interesting as a separate discussion, because it really, I think, goes beyond the event itself, since it's very innovative in my point of view. I think you'll find it to be provocative and also help for a different way of thinking, and maybe help to frame some issues that you may be trying to solve where you are. So let's start off again with, if people haven't seen the last episode yet, Lucy, Noreen, please go ahead and introduce yourself and also what inspires you and your role with Pharmageddon.
Absolutely. Hi, my name is Lucy Osborne. I'm Senior Event Manager at Impatient and the main producer for Pharmageddon USA. And I just think an event like this is so important. It shakes the industry up and it gets to the key issues at hand.
Yeah, and hello to both of you and to everyone listening. So my name is Noreen Sajwani. I'm the head of consulting at Impatient Health. So I lead our consultancy practice that looks at things like patient engagement, medical and commercial excellence, and org design and culture change, which are all sort of topics that are woven into the agenda that we've got. I'm also one of the hosts alongside Paul Sims, our CEO at Pharmageddon. So very excited to be here and share this space with both of you today.
Excellent, thank you. So Pharmageddon is structured around a really interesting agenda. And so let's get right into that. Tell me about the structure of the agenda.
So our agenda is based around the 4 A's. It's a model that Paul Sims referenced in Pharmageddon Europe last year. And it is all about audacity, attention, accountability, and action. And the reason that we use these 4 A's is we believe it's a pathway. So audacity attracts attention, which creates accountability, which drives action. In other words, the bigger and more audacious our goals are, the more likely they are to happen. Incrementalism is not the answer to a motivated team.
Yeah, and I think what Lucy talks about is that last bit around incrementalism is really something that we try to do, not just with sort of Pharmageddon as a discussion point or as an activity or an event, but really it's kind of how do we bring that element to break down the incremental change. We always talk about change happening in almost a linear fashion. It's almost a slope. But then you've got events like COVID that come in and really disrupt. And a lot of our work, I think, is centered around that disruption. So it's really a framework or a path for us to be able to break that incremental approach that people often find themselves slogging away in day after day in an industry that can be slower than others like pharma.
So really we're talking about the different types of innovation. And I think it's important to kind of anchor the audience on those types of innovations. Then we get down to what are we really looking at for the future?
Yeah, so a lot of and this is more looking at the methodology behind what effectively does influence the 4 A's. But, when we look at, for example, imagine a 2x2 matrix, you've kind of got your technology and then you've got your market. And when you're trying to get new technology into an existing market, that's incremental innovation, right? It's one kind of element that's being changed in that environment. A reorg within a company can be seen as incremental innovation for that fact, right? It's a different type of process that's being introduced to an existing structure. But what we're really interested in looking at is kind of a new technology in a new aspect of a market. And that kind of hints us towards disruptive or actually radical innovation. And I think, a lot of times people will say, oh, radical innovation is a great philosophical exercise. It's a great thought process. But actually, how do I make that tangible? We hear this a lot in client conversations.
Yeah.
How do I approach this how do I make this tangible for my local market? How do I put this in practice tomorrow? I have a job that I have to do. And so to kind of find that balance between incremental innovation and then that radical innovation, this is where sort of our work in disruptive innovation sits. And so it kind of blends that sort of balance between kind of how we have new technology and we're trying to work within an existing market like pharma, but we're using that new technology in a way that allows us to maintain a competitive edge, that allows us to reimagine, healthcare, as is actually one of the topics of the Pharmageddon sessions that we do as well.
Yeah, so on that topic, and when you talk about radical innovation, I did notice that there's a description also in the preparation for the event about redesigning health, not just health care. So it might sound the same to some people, but please discuss how you see the difference.
Yeah, well, this is actually part of our solve session. So, this isn't a panel discussion. It goes into something that Noreen has created with her amazing team, where we use a mixture of, strategic design and futures thinking, and really dig deep into putting people into a different world, or really making them think differently. Noreen can talk more on the actual the workings of how this solve session goes, but it's really clever.
Yeah, and I won't give away.
I'll just inform the audience that in the last episode we did go through a little bit of that. But Noreen, please.
Yeah, for sure. And I won't give away too much, because Lucy will probably be very upset if we give away the telltale secrets of the agenda. But I think, when we look at something like health versus healthcare, we are typically, as an industry, centering ourselves around the assumption that we are ill, that disease happens, and we have to deal with that, right? That's caring for our health. And I think one of the reasons why, Lucy and the team really thought about, let's not just redesign healthcare, let's redesign health, is because looking at health as a concept brings us so much broader into what is it to be well, not just what is it to be ill. Instead of looking at cures for diseases, why don't we look at how we can maintain quality of life as a metric that we serve. One of the things that Lucy's been great about is to say, let's bring in other industries into the discussion. The well-being industry has skyrocketed over the last 5 years, particularly with COVID, and health is, the emotional, the social, the physical, it's the mental, it's all these aspects of well-being. And so there's almost a duty, there's an obligation that we have to bring those aspects of the conversation to the forefront and really get people to not just think about the medicines that we're creating or even a beyond the pill solution, but really, what are those futures that we could be living in? And let's say there are no more patients that are ill ever again. What does that world look like? How can we still contribute as pharma into that world in the future? And I think that's some of the bits that we'll try to explore, hopefully, in the session.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because as you bring together a group of people in these solve sessions, one of the things is people come from the seat they're currently sitting in. And that seat is probably not, future proof, let's say. It's not going to serve the future of redesigning health as you describe. And when we look at even everything going on today, wherever you are, we are all impacted by health, because we all experienced our own health. As you said, Lucy, in the last episode, the healthcare industry is healthcare is the one thing that binds us all together, right? And so we go back to, well, how are we experiencing disease? But then, to your point, Noreen, how are we experiencing the human condition? So it goes broader than disease management, but let's go to the fundamentals of what does health actually mean, and how do we create a framework, a societal framework within which we can all work together to serve that future, however it may be designed. So talking about that future, I want to get into a little bit about the innovation design concepts here. Noreen, I think you're one of the experts in this area. And speculative design is something I've heard you talk about. Could you explain to the audience what that means, and can that be applied to the situation of radical innovation and future thinking?
Yeah, totally. So, speculative design is one of those more theoretical approaches that you can read all about. And I sort of became exposed to it when I first joined Impatient a few years ago. But really the idea is that, we live and think in the present. We're informed by the past, but rarely do we ever think about what does the future hold, and what can I do today to create my future? And I think that's what speculative design really does, is it's the belief in multiple futures, right? The past has been set, the present is what you're experiencing, but really the future is unwritten, right? To quote Natasha Bedingfield, if I may. And so it means that we've got to then say to ourselves, well, there could be so many possibilities. And part of speculative design and part of futures thinking is to say, there are futures of health. There's multiple futures. And it's our responsibility to look at some of those different futures and then use that to say, what's the path that I want to go down myself? It's almost manifesting, right? We do this on a year-to-year basis. I've got loads of friends that have, their mood boards for the new year, and they've manifested what they want from that year. If we're going to do that in our lives, why don't we do that in healthcare? That is our life at the center of it. And so futures thinking gives us that framework. It gives us that approach to look at it. And speculative design then says, it takes it a step further. So it says, great, you've built these possible futures, but within a business context, within, an industry that we operate in, there are some that are going to be probable. There are some that are more likely than others. And then there's what we call the preferable future. And those are the futures that's the future that we want to create. It's the one we're going to manifest. And it allows us to almost imagine it as a funnel, right? You've got tons of possibilities, you've got some probabilities, and then you've got your preferable future. And that framework then allows us to say, when I go back to my desk tomorrow, what are the steps that I'm going to take in order to get to my preferable future? And that's where, back casting, and a lot of times people do forecasting. So this is the opposite of that. It's back casting to say, that's what I want. What am I going to do to get there? It's almost goal setting, if you want to call it that, but in a way that really kind of starts broader and then narrows down.
I really like this concept because, yes, I think in experience, we focus more on the forecasting because we're looking at the ROI and approvability by the regulatory agencies and product market fit and all that stuff. And how is it serving the patient, and what evidence do we need to do just that? But this idea of backcasting is, if I'm understanding correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that as we imagine these futures, and it almost makes me think of like a multiverse kind of thing, right? There can be all these different futures, but now let's think back. What do we need to do today to make that future come forward or be viable? So in a way, you have more agency over what actions we're taking. Because I often find when we do forecasting, especially in a radical innovation, we don't know what's happening tomorrow. There could be all sorts of external events. Data could go in a different way. Maybe you have to redo clinical studies. Maybe there's other experts that have to come in. All sorts of things can happen. And you might need a completely different business model. So you have to do a lot of experimentation, and therefore it becomes a little bit difficult to predict that forecasting. I mean, the regulations could completely change, and a lot of regulations are not there yet. If you talk about, a very different future, everything will be recreated. So I really like this concept of backcasting. Did I get that correct?
Exactly. And I think, if I can be provocative,
Please.
Any company that does forecasting is doing it wrong. And I'll tell you why. When you do forecasting, you're often looking at trends, as you say. You're looking at what's going to happen in the future, best guess based on what I've got in my regulatory environment, in the clinical trial data that I'm seeing, in sort of the general demographics, what you're not considering is how people change as they age. So one of the things that, Lucy has done an incredible job with incorporating into this particular agenda is having a Gen Z panel. And it's so important that we have that conversation, because that is the experience that you're talking about, Zena, that we miss in forecasting. We don't understand how people's thought processes, their emotions, their preferences, their behaviors will change, and how then healthcare will not serve today's individual in 5 years' time, but how are we going to design healthcare for serving the generation of 5 years from now, right, as they grow and evolve. So Lucy, I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about kind of that Gen Z panel, if you will, because I think it provides a really unique way of reimagining forecasting almost.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, with this is the lead on from, this is the attention part. So it's the first day, it's the afternoon. We've spoken about audacity, and now we're into attention, capturing the hearts and minds. So the Gen Z voices, the future is here, and are we ready to listen? They're driven by purpose, tech, sustainability, things that not necessarily are at our forefront of what we are thinking about in our day-to-day lives. So it gives us a little bit of insight into what the future of pharma is really going to be thinking about. And for me, that is insanely important, especially when we're looking at this attention part of the agenda, leading us down this funnel from audacity.
On that point, in the last episode, we also talked about how do you curate people, participants, to come to this type of, again, non-conference, unconference, but event. And I think, as you said, we started with audacity and then going into attention. And part of that, I think, was, finding that common ground, because you have to be on the same playing field, I guess, foundationally, if you're going to then do a future casting, back casting, right? So that you can actually have those meaningful conversations. So remind the audience a bit on how you curate attendees to such an event. Since it takes audacity, it really requires busting down the today and the norms that everyone keeps doing the way it is because it's the way it is. And incremental innovation sometimes is easier, but it may not actually benefit. If we're talking about redesigning the future in health, you need those people in the room who also can take back to their organizations and foster that change.
It's a bit different really with the Gen Z panel, because we're not necessarily looking just at pharma execs that can go back and take stuff back into their organizations. Yes, the other panels and the other participants, that is more focused on that and looking at their everyday to day. The Gen Z panel is more of an inspirational, educational panel where we look at opinions of not just people that work in pharma. We're looking at young people in general, Gen Zers in general, and saying, what are the topics they want to speak about? What are they hesitant about? What are we going to find the blockers in the future? And how do we have a conversation that means that we don't end up in a sticky situation later down the line? Because, at the end of the day, they're going to be taking our jobs in one way or another. So, we have to know what they're thinking.
Yeah, it reminds me of, there used to be all these discussions about the millennials.
No, we're so old hat now.
Yeah, they're old now, and it's all dated.
Yeah, I know, we're becoming like the boomers now. So
yeah, anyone older than the current age is I guess lumped in with the boomers.
Yeah, it'll be Gen Alpha soon, and the Gen Zers will be like so lame. So
Well, and I think it's, it's interesting, Lucy, that you say that, because one of the things that I was sort of arguing on the Gen Z panel that we did, the webinar that we did earlier this year through Impatient Health, was stop looking at Gen Z as your target audience. If you're doing that, you're already behind. Gen Beta is actually, they're the ones that we're serving healthcare for, because it starts, health starts in the womb, right? It's pre-birth. It's kind of maternal health. It's women's health. And so, we now have the first set of Gen Beta babies that are being born. They're the ones that HCPs need to be looking at supporting, because they're also the ones that are going to be coming into internal medicine very soon. It's not just the OBGYNs and the pediatricians that are going to be serving them. So really, how do we genuinely think in kind of a foresight mindset to really, I think the Gen Z conversation becomes more tangible and more kind of pertinent, right? So it's Zena, it's that point that you spoke about earlier in terms of, let's make it actionable. And so we want to kind of open up that conversation, but definitely I would argue it doesn't stop there. If you're not thinking about Gen Alpha or Gen Beta by the end of these 2 days, I would argue we failed, and we need to go back and do another Pharmageddon with you where we kind of bring that to the table as well.
Yeah, and we actually we go further down the rabbit hole when we go into our solve session at the end of day 1, and I won't give too much away, but there is we deal directly with misinformation, TikTok videos. It's very interactive, and we're going to really take people out of their comfort zones completely, and make them think about how people are digesting their information, and how the other generations are really, engaging with pharma and healthcare.
So just a little note on how inspiring these events are. At last year's event, my attendance there was so thought-provoking for me that part of my follow-up was also putting myself out of my comfort zone and say, right, I've been in corporate for over 20 years. I've now founded my own company. What is my responsibility here in trying to be a change agent? And so hence this podcast was born, to really bring forward those stories and help to bring forward different ways of thinking so that we can prepare and have those agnostic conversations and really go back to, well, what does health mean? What does improving the human condition mean? Because it is needed. And you were talking about Beta being born. This just blew my mind, because, we're still trying to grasp with, well, the generation that was born in digital. Now we've got generation born in AI, and who knows, singularity might be coming at some point around the corner here. So talk about radical change. That means that how individuals are going to engage with their health, how they're going to engage with the healthcare system, however that may be, how healthcare is going to be served. Everything is going to change, because that's just the fact of life now, with technology and everything advancing so quickly. But also with data, people will have much more information about what's actually happening in their bodies, and being able to have that agency to say, right, something needs to be different because my health is not being served here. And that also leads to even stronger, more radical patient advocacy, I think, as well, which is a key component for this event, is also patient advocacy.
Yeah, and I think that leads on into the third part of the agenda, which is accountability. So we're looking at, we've looked at vaccine hesitancy, we've looked at Gen Z, we've looked at fake news, and then we go into the start of day 2, going into, okay, so what is our accountability? How are we building and earning trust? Trust as a new currency, ethics and regulation. We're getting into the thorny topics, which has been like, okay, big ideas, let's really think broadly, and now let's dig down. How do we make this a reality, and how do we take accountability for the things that we do in pharma?
Hello again. If the content of this video resonates with you, join the InnoPathways waitlist for early access to new content, offers, and our Founders Bundle for new programming. We'd love to have you join the community. The link's below in the notes. And I think, Noreen, in those solve sessions that you've designed, part of bringing forward and that accountability part that Lucy was talking about is also in the room and in those conversations, having that trust to really tackle things head on and break down your maybe dated thoughts and really try to reimagine the future. And I think, as we talked about on the last podcast, last episode, where it doesn't really matter where you sit in the organization, right? It's all about, okay, we all experience healthcare, so we all have something to contribute.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, alongside that, a lot of kind of the common ground that we spoke about earlier, that's got to be a place that happens, not, there's multiple levels of that. So you've got the ecosystem of health, which is, how does pharma work with policymakers? How do payers work with HCPs? How do we all sort of work in this intertwined web to make health work and work well for the individual? And that's kind of the accountability element. But then I think when you kind of move into things like, what is our responsibility towards bringing that, ecosystem into a future that we're proud of having created? We have that agency, that ability to then act on what we believe is the best course for the futures of healthcare. And I think that's where, Lucy's point around, how are we defining trust in the future? Trust is a very, I would argue, overrated word in pharma. We all talk about getting HCP trust, so we want HCPs to, want patients to trust us. But what does that actually mean? I would argue value is another term that, in one part of the organization, to a CFO, value is looked at very differently than to a market access team. And so we need to almost find common ground within our organizations of, even if there are multiple definitions of one of those terms, which definition are we using in which context? Because that allows us to then build those common principles. And, we frame it around principles of innovation and how we do ethical innovation, how we look at kind of furthering the industry in a way where, back to the concept of the human condition, we're doing it in a humane way. We're doing it in a way that's true to kind of who we are as people. And I think that that's why, those elements coming to play all at once create this milieu of, almost chaos, I would argue, but also then hopefully tangible impact.
Exactly. And we can ask those questions like, what would it take for pharma to become the most trusted industry in the world? I mean, it's a big take, but we as an event, we can ask those and dig down into, like, what would it really take for us to be a really trusted industry in the world?
Exactly.
And I think that's really interesting, because it means that we also have to acknowledge that there is a gap in trust.
Yeah.
Right. And we also have to acknowledge that, you mentioned the term value. Value can mean something very different to different people, different areas. What does value mean? Some could think of it as financial, but there's all sorts of ways that you can define value. And in redesigning health, what does that mean? What do we expect value to mean in the future?
Yeah. And particularly, I think, when we look at Pharmageddon as an event, we obviously have Pharmageddon USA and Pharmageddon Europe, and even just the same topic in two different markets provides for really, really different perspectives. So if you have a global biopharma organization, having that awareness of what might, value mean in the US is actually very different from what it means in Europe. And it's actually even more fundamentally different and potentially not even the priority in Southeast Asia, for example, because we're looking at trust as our key performance indicator. And so those are, I think, some of the conversations that we're hoping to spark, as Lucy says, but that's the work, that's the action that needs to come out of the event, right? And really kind of the final part of the agenda tries to crystallize that by saying, okay, you've got a whole bunch of thorny challenges that you probably need to go away and work out with your team. What are you going to do to start that conversation? Because if the conversation ends at Pharmageddon, again, that's us failing. That's not the point. It's right? Is when Pharmageddon's over, that's when the work really starts.
Yeah, and on that point, with redesigning health and these new methods of tackling healthcare and building trust, how do you know that you've improved it? Imagine it's going to take some metrics and maybe even different layers of metrics, because one metric may not actually give the entire story, or it can be biased within itself. So this leads to a lot more thinking and action, even afterwards.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think, even when we look at how do we measure the success of Pharmageddon, Lucy says it better than anybody else. Pharmageddon is the event that's born to die. So when this event no longer exists, that's when we've hit our success metric overall.
Yeah, there you go.
And I think that when we look at then kind of, as you say, that progression over time, or the kind of KPIs or metrics that have been set in an organization year on year, you do see incremental progress. And that's okay, because, not everything needs to be radical. There needs to be a radical kind of change that happens that sort of sparks that. But then it does require slow, steady growth over time, until you have the next thing that then can provide that disruption. And so it's almost this game of like checks and checkers that we're playing, right? Like, which one are we going to be calculated in how we're progressing, or are we going to really just shuffle it all up and try to start again? And that's a really difficult conversation that, quite frankly, a lot of the attendees are grappling with. A lot of folks will come to us and say, how do I measure HCP engagement in a way that's meaningful? And that's within our consultancy. That's measurement frameworks is something that we look at a lot with our clients, but it really relies on us understanding what is that goal that we're headed towards. Because sometimes, just because it's slow and steady doesn't mean that we're not doing it right. And I think that's kind of a conversation that folks need to maybe have within their teams or their organization as well.
So I think that what you just said is very heartening as well, because when you're in an organization and you are following your SOPs and you've got your processes and your way of structuring projects and going through stage gate, methodologies and all of these things, you come in with the concept of, right, this is radical innovation. That can really set everyone on edge, though. Wait a minute, what the heck are you talking about? And it could even have the impression of maybe being too futuristic. However, I think part of the ground truths here is, as everything is advancing so quickly, and as we are impacted so much more quickly by one action somewhere, and then suddenly we're all impacted. And I think you define one of them, which is kind of the TikTok whole thing and all of that. So that's just one aspect of that. But it's radical innovation, but I think I'm hearing it's also experimentation.
I would definitely say so. And I mean, who better to experiment than a discipline that focuses on science, right? I think a lot of times, you can look at the value chain across pharma, and you can argue, and I would be interested to do this exercise and say, what is the most innovative part of the value chain? Some would say it's the scientists, of course, because they're doing R&D. Some would say, oh, well, it's that critical point where we're, looking to launch a product, launch excellence T minus 24 months, because that's where we have the power to look at the rules differently or interpret them differently. Some would say, once the product is out on the market and you're working with people and real world evidence and trying to kind of change things in an environment that's constantly evolving, that's when the innovation happens. But I think in each of those phases, what we forget is what starts at the very beginning of the value chain, that experimentation. It's from chemicals all the way to consumption, isn't it? That innovation never actually stops, but for some reason we become more and more afraid. It's kind of like when we grow up, we forget that we need to play, because play is an important part of the creative thinking process. And I think in the same way, what you're saying is experimentation is an important part of the process, because if we're not doing that, we're not being true to who we are as people that work in the healthcare industry.
So we often have to keep creating.
Yeah.
So that brings us to action. And can you tie that in, Lucy, action with the Pharmageddon manifesto?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the action, we're turning ambition into impact. And without action, audacity is just noise. So what we then do is we'll go into a few panel sessions looking at, it from insights to implementation, winning the culture wars, and then really digging down into the Pharmageddon manifesto and what that means. And that is a pledge to the industry, to your fellow colleagues, to everybody that is related to healthcare, which is everybody in the world, and on to do better and to be more audacious and to think outside the box and create a different future for us all.
So I love what you said about audacity. It goes. It's not just noise. And I have been in many meetings where, now that you describe it that way, yeah, it's been a lot of noise. Where we all wondered afterwards, wait a minute, so what are we doing now?
I think that's what's so important about people like you, Zena, as well, when we look at regulatory as not as a barrier, but as a vehicle for innovation and to get us to the end of the line. So it is regulatory is a massive part of bringing it all to fruition and not using regulatory as an excuse not to innovate, basically.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Thank you. Music to my ears as a reg professional here. It's an enabler, not a blocker. And I think the same is true for medical affairs as well. There's also innovation that comes from there in clinical design. There's so many different ways of thinking about evidence now. Especially when we look at rare diseases and what does benefit risk mean. It's very different in looking at the condition. Your whole framework of benefit risk is different because the risk of doing nothing is oftentimes greater than doing something. So you're going to rethink what benefit risk means. So it all starts with audacity. It definitely takes audacity.
Yeah.
But then we follow through with the attention, accountability. Let me see, do I get this all right?
No, you're nailing it. Absolutely.
And action. And let's not forget the action. So really it all ties together, but it starts with audacity and rethinking for the future. And I would say this is not just play, it's actually necessary, because if we don't have that futuristic thinking and the backcasting, healthcare is going to suffer.
Absolutely. And I think the main takeaway from an event like this is not just those aha moments and those take backs. It's also about the community of people that you leave the room with, from different companies that you can be like, right, they gave me those insights, and it's an insight sharing exercise as well to help make your life and your job easier. And those little gems often come from not the panelists on the stage or Noreen and Paul doing their thing. It's actually, sometimes it just comes from the person sitting next to you that you've sat in a solve session with that have said, do you know, this is the barrier I have in my company. And I think that's another beautiful part of Pharmageddon, which you don't get at other events.
Yeah, that's so true. So true. And so I'm really looking forward to attending the event this year. It's actually coming up very soon. April 23rd and 24th for USA. And then you mentioned Pharmageddon Europe, which is actually where it all started. And Pharmageddon USA actually came on demand by request. So here we are. And I imagine a future Pharmageddon, should Pharmageddon still be needed, it could be AI robots that are on the panel and synthesizing all of the data and telling us some key insights.
We have the Pharmageddon Europe is coming up in October. I don't want to get this wrong. I think it's the 8th and 9th of October in Amsterdam. So if anyone wants to join us there, we'll be building on this agenda. It only gets bigger and better every time.
So Pharmageddon USA, Pharmageddon Europe, and really, I think what we discussed in this episode and the prior episode is really agnostic to the actual timing of the event. I think these are important concepts to think about and bring into our daily lives and our organizations, and really think about, okay, what's the part that I am individually playing in healthcare, and how can I reimagine in my organization? So if you're not able to attend the event, do engage. I think, these are really important concepts, and hopefully these messages resonate, and we'll continue to bring forward guests on this podcast. And Lucy and Noreen, do you want to share thoughts in future? Please come back.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to say, if any of this is interested, anybody, and if you can't make Pharmageddon, that's fine. Reach out to myself and Noreen. We're always looking for people to build a community of disruptors with. So don't hesitate to reach out to us, and hope to see you all in Philly and Amsterdam and in the future.
So calling all disruptors and radical innovators.
Disruptors, come find us.
Exactly. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. It's been great having this time with you. Take care.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, Zena.
Bye.
Bye-bye.